Light painting can be a very tricky method to light up your car photography with. Bringing in that depth, creativity, and avoiding this boring, flat look can also be very daunting. However, my Lithuanian friend Dominic, who has been progressing his car photography game, is going to show us how he used light painting to come up with this awesome shot. Now, this is not the typical entertainment video that you would see on other channels. Dominic is going to show us, right from the beginning, the selection process in Lightroom, the basic adjustments, and then he's going to walk us through the post-processing technique in Adobe Photoshop. Like I said, you wouldn't find this in these other fluffy entertainment channels. Anyway, Dominic went out of his way to create this awesome, insightful video. And a way to say thank you is to like and share this video, follow his Instagram account. I left a link to his Instagram account in the description below, so make sure to check it out. All right, that's it for me. Dominic, the floor is all yours right after the intro.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction, Mo. For those who haven't seen me before, I'm an automotive and lifestyle photographer based in Lithuania. And today we're going to have the chance to dive a bit more in depth into one off-camera lighting technique called light painting. It's actually pretty widely used by various automotive photographers. And today I'm going to show you the retouching process behind it, or at least how I do it personally. Now, the photo that we're working on today is of this 1976 Porsche 911. It's an absolutely magnificent car, and I wanted to add some artistic elements to the final photo, like adding some color casts of cyan and magenta to basically have a more 80s look to the final image. Before we begin, I'd suggest that you have at least a basic understanding of how light painting works in automotive photography. That'll help you get the most out of this tutorial. And if you don't already, Mo has a lot of great content on his channel, so just head on over there and start learning. And if you like this image and you want to see more of my work, you can always head on over to my Instagram account, which is @LiberianPhotography. I usually post there once a week, and I also add some stories with some behind-the-scenes content from my photo shoots. Right, I think that's enough rambling. Let's open up Lightroom and get to work. So now that we are in Lightroom, as you can see, I already marked the photos that we're going to use in the edit. So I'm just going to quickly go through each and one of these and tell you what we're going to use them for in the final Photoshop edit. So the first exposure that we have here is just basically an ambient exposure. I didn't do any light painting over here. And regarding the settings that I applied onto the image in Lightroom, and this goes for all of these photos, I just basically went in onto lens corrections and I removed chromatic aberration and enabled profile corrections. So this just basically removes vignetting and just any distortion that's in the photo. And I also went onto the transform tab and just basically put on vertical, because without it, it was a bit wonky, as you can see. So this goes for all of these photos, just these two settings. And the next photo that we have is also an ambient exposure, but it's just way darker. I basically exposed for these lights over here that I will use in the final image. Moving on, we can see that I already started light painting in this exposure. This was just basically a pass behind the car, like I was walking like that. As you can see, I have the ground lit up and basically the back of the car. So that's what I'm going to use this exposure for, most likely. The next one is also pretty much the same exposure. I also walked behind the car. But in this one, as we can see, we had a bit more of the background that's lit up, so we're going to use that in the edit as well. And now, as you can see, we have a side pass of the car. I basically just held the light above the car and walked along the side of it. So we just have the whole side of the car lit up with the wheels and a bit of the ground, so we're going to use that. I also did a second side pass just to get any information that I didn't get with the previous one, just to be safe. It's always good when light painting to do pretty much as many exposures as you can, because once you go back home and you get into Photoshop, you'll probably hate yourself for not getting as much exposures as you can. Just shoot as much as you can on location, light everything, even if you don't think that you're going to need it. You probably might need it when you're editing in Photoshop, and your future self will thank you. Next up, in this exposure, I held the light a bit lower and basically walked again on the side of the car. And as we can see, in this exposure, the wheels are way more lit up, so I'm probably going to use this for lighting up the wheels and maybe the ground over here as well. This next one is another side pass. So we're going to grab all of these three passes in Photoshop just so we have more options when editing and see which part of the car maybe looks best in one of these images. So moving on, I have one more pass of the rear of the car, just to be safe. And now we have a pass of a rim light. And basically how you do a rim light pass is you walk in front of your car, you hold the light up high, as you can see over here. You need to hold it high so that if you hold it lower, then this line would be right around here. And if we did a pass lower, then you would see that it would actually hit the car silhouette, and it wouldn't actually give this rim line that we actually want. So when doing rim light exposures, try to hold the light as high as you can so you can get as much of the silhouette as possible. So basically hold the light up high, just aim at the camera and try to walk along the whole silhouette of the car. Over here, as you can see, I couldn't really get the whole pass behind the car, so I just continued it pretty much from the middle of the car. I as well held the lights really high and just basically walked all around the car. As you can see, it has this nice rim line on the spoiler over here, and on the bumper, and as well on the wheels over here, which is really nice. I'm going to use that exposure. Now, I also wanted to get an exposure that's primarily used for the foreground, which, as you can see in this image, I put these very beautiful Porsche wheels in the foreground just to add some visual interest in the image. And I wanted to add some light on these wheels. So this exposure is just going to be for these wheels. Last but not least, we have the exposure of the lights. So again, no light painting going on over here. All I did is I turned on the lights of the car, and I basically just set the exposure to expose for the headlights and for the tail lights. Nothing too crazy going on here. Now that we can see all the exposures that I had, we can move into Photoshop. So how you do that is to basically select all these exposures. As you can see, I have 13 over here. Right click it, go to Edit In, and open as layers in Photoshop. Now that we are in Photoshop, let me explain you how I did all of my editing. So we can see that the first layer that we have is just an ambient exposure. And before I do any sort of editing with light painting, the first thing that I do is I mask out the car. I take the pen tool, I just go in, and I just pretty much do this throughout the whole of the car. So it's a lengthy process, but my advice to you would be to make the mask as clean and as precise as you can, because this will help you like in the long run when editing. A good mask will just help you out a bunch. And now that we have the mask of the car, what I like to do is I like to create a new layer and just click this mask button over here, and that just creates a mask of the car itself. So it's pretty useful, like when you're editing, to just go back to this layer, Control or Command click on this, and you have the mask at your hand whenever you need it. So the first layer that we're going to basically build everything on isn't actually going to be this one, it's going to be this one, which is pretty much the same ambient exposure, just way darker. We're not actually going to use that for anything. Now that we have the base ambience exposure layer, I did mention in the beginning that we're going to add some color casts to the final image to basically have a more 80s look to it. So I'm actually going to show you how we did that right here. It's basically done using hue and saturation layers, which are over here. So you would usually click on the layer that you want to use. You would click on hue and saturation, click on a clipping mask, select colorize, and that way you can basically have any color that you want. Go to the color wheel and you can see. And what I did here is I did just that. I took a hue and saturation layer, I added some cyan to it, which is around over here, and I masked it basically everywhere except on this part over here, because I'm going to want that little piece of light to be a different color. And as you can see, if we turn this layer on and off, we just turn all of these previously white lights to cyan, which is really cool in my opinion. And for this light over here, I added the same hue and saturation layer, but this time it's magenta. So over here. And again, I masked over just to that light over there, as you can see over here. And that is basically how you add these different color casts to already existing lights and images. You could use like color drills on location to add to these lights, but I didn't really have the time to do that, so this is just a workaround in post. When I'm combining light painting exposures, what I like to do is I always prefer to basically have the subject or the car all black, so it doesn't have any ambient light affecting it. It's pretty much dark. Then you can just stack your exposures which you light painted onto it, and you won't have any ambient light bleeding. So it's just a good practice, at least for me. Moving on, we're going to add the light painting exposures. And the first one that we're going to add is this pass of the back of the car. I felt like it was a pretty good choice for a base exposure because it also had some light on the shelves over here, on the wheels as well, a lot of light on the ground, which is just pretty good in general. So if we add this exposure, we can see that it pretty much lights up the back of the car and the background. I'll get to all of these masks in a bit. When we add the light painting exposure, we run into a bit of a problem that all of these reflections and this ground is bleeding from the base ambience exposure that we have over here. So to combat that, I just basically masked out all of these things that I don't want to see in this image on the base ambience layer. So if we enable the mask, you can see that I basically removed this part of the ground, I removed these reflections on the gates, and these reflections on the wheels as well. So now we don't have any cyan light bleeding onto the photo. Now I wanted to add a bit more light on this lower part of the bumper over here, and how I did that is I basically found an exposure in which this part is lit pretty well, which was actually in the rear exposure. I added it on lighten and just basically masked out the part which is this one. And if we click that on and off, we can see that it adds light on the place that I wanted to. I mean, 100% is a bit too strong. We can just keep it at 50. It just adds a little bit of detail in the lower part of the bumper. Moving on, I wanted to bring more light to the side of the car. So we're going to introduce the side pass to the image, which is this exposure over here. It just basically lights the side of the car. So when we add it, we can have more lights on the vehicle itself, but we run into a problem that the rest of the exposure bleeds everywhere into the background, as you can see on the wheels, on the ground. So we just simply take the mask that we had and just add it to this exposure. So now it's just on the side of the car where we want it. Once we introduce the side pass, we can notice that there's a lot of unwanted reflections in the image that could be pretty easily removed. For example, these light spots on the chrome of the wheels. The whole gate is covered in reflections that I didn't like. So what I did over here, if we take the side pass, for example, just this one exposure, let me remove the mask, we can see that it lights up the side of the car without those reflections that are distracting. Because those reflections get introduced from actually the base layer. So what we can do over here is we don't need to manually mask out these reflections with the clone stamp tool or the healing brush tool. What we can do is just introduce a mask to the base layer to basically remove these parts from the base layer, but actually leave them visible from the side pass, because in the side pass they don't have these things. So if we actually introduce that mask over here, we can see that it removes all of those reflections that I didn't like. So if I click on the mask, you can see which parts I worked on. So for example, this weird blob of light, I removed it and just left the side pass. These reflections on the chrome, a few of the reflections of the body, and as well the gate. I didn't really like how these reflections looked. So what I did is I pretty much just masked out the whole part of it. Now it's just dark, but I'm going to introduce an exposure later on from which I like how that part of the image looked, and just basically introduce it. So again, I added a mask on the base layer to remove some of the reflection that I didn't want without having to clone stamp them out. But I am going to need to clone stamp all of these things because, well, they're on the base exposure. So moving on, we're actually going to fix this black blob of darkness. I used this exposure over here, which is again a pass of the back of the car, but I liked how the gate looked actually from this exposure. So what I did is I actually introduced this exposure and added a mask just for the gate and as well on the ground over here, because without it there was also this patch of darkness over here which didn't look very appealing. And having that on and having the mask is I basically just lightened up the gates and lightened up this ground over here with this exposure. Next up, we have the rim light and seats, which is this exposure over here. Again, as the name suggests, it's the rim light. But now again, if we don't have any masks, it just bleeds everywhere. So I introduced the mask, and with the mask, I masked out this part of the top of the car. So as we can see, this line just beautifully accentuates the silhouettes, because I didn't really want it on the side of the car and anywhere else, just on the top of the car. As well, I also noticed when editing how this exposure hits this part of the tire. Just this little blob of light adds a lot to the image and just makes your eye just go to that part, which I really liked. So I also masked out this part. And as the name suggests, I also added this light on the seats as well over here. So without it and with it, it just basically adds this cool rim exposure to these seats. So basically this exposure was just to add some rim everywhere, on the tire, on the car, and on the seats over here. And I also added some hue and saturation layers onto this rim light layer. So the first one is this one, which, as we can see, adds just a tiny hint of pink onto the top of the car, and just a tiny hint of pink onto the tire over here. Then again, remember, this is all fake. We're just faking how this light would hit the background in real life. So I thought that this light would go over the car and hit this tire over here. So as we can see, it just adds some pink to those parts. And also I added a cyan layer. This one is basically for this part over here, to basically fake how these two lights would hit this piece of the image. So if we turn that on and off, we can see just how much ambience that adds. I really like how that looks. And when we move forwards, I added a really small rim light to the spoiler over here, because I actually found an exposure which is from the side of the rim light, and I liked how this line looked on the spoiler, so I just basically introduced it to this part over here. As you can see, it's very minuscule and you're probably not even going to notice it, but it's just a small detail to add. Now I also wanted to add a bit more ambience onto the wing itself, and I did that again with the hue and saturation layer. And as we can see, if we can click on the mask, I basically just masked out this part of the wing, and I added a cyan hue and saturation layer on it, because I wanted to fake this light over here hitting the wing and add just more ambience to the photo itself. So if we turn that on and off, we can see that it just becomes cyan. Yeah, after that I started working on this foreground, which is these wheels, because right now they just have no lights on them and they just look horrible. So the first thing that I did is I masked them out. Again, it's very important to mask things that you want to work on independently in your retouching process, because that way you don't have to use like a brush, which is not very precise. It's going to bleed everywhere. So I really suggest masking as many things as you can and just working like that, because it just helps to add depth in the photo in general. And once I masked out these wheels, just how I did with the car, I'm going to introduce a black layer onto them, just so I can build like my own exposures on them, and I don't really have to see any ambient light hitting these wheels. So again, this is just a black layer with a mask on these wheels. Yeah, but I also like removed this little part over here because I wanted to keep this hint of magenta onto these wheels. So I masked that out. And after that, I used this exposure, which was just for these wheels. As we can see, it hits the wheels in a really nice way. So I added this exposure, and I added the mask from just wheels, as you can see over here. And that's pretty much it. Oh yeah, and I also added a hue and saturation layer as well, because again, all of these blue lights, they're hitting the card, they're hitting this part over here, and logically it would probably hit this part of the wheel as well. So introducing some cyan, it just adds some ambience to the photo and makes everything look cooler. And after that, I felt like the ground was a bit too dark, so I wanted to introduce a bit more light onto it. So basically I found a layer, I found a layer which I liked how this part looked of the ground, and I introduced it in this photo. And just basically masked in the part which I wanted to add more light on. So if we click this layer on and off, we can see just how much it lights the ground over here. After that, I also felt like the wheels could use a little bit more punch onto them. So I took this exposure over here, which was again a side pass, but it had a bit more light on the wheels. And I just basically masked in the exposure to these parts over here. And remember, everything is on lighten, so it just basically stacks above each and every layer. So if we introduce this exposure, it just adds a bit more light onto the wheels, as you can see over here. And one more thing that I added in terms of fill lights is basically I added some highlights on this part of the bumper cards, I guess how they're called. So what I used over here is I basically took an exposure, which is this one. It's again a side pass, but like a lower one, so I get more light on the lower part of the car. And I liked how these little highlights looked. So I basically took that, I introduced a mask to these two parts of the image, and I just masked them in. It just adds a bit more depth to the car itself. Now moving on, when we look at the colors in the image itself, we can see there's cyans over here, there's magenta over there, some more cyans over here, but then the ground is like yellow. It didn't really make sense. So I introduced some more hue and saturation layers, but I masked them in on the ground. So if we take this one and see the mask, I just basically made the ground a lot more blue and cyan. So if we turn it on and off, you can see it just really puts everything together a bit more. Because this wouldn't really make sense if these lights were actually blue in real life. So with this hue and saturation layer, I just added some cyan to the ground. And I also wanted to add some more ambience from this magenta over here. And how I did that is, again, a hue and saturation layer, and I masked this part because logically this part is behind the car, and that's where more of this magenta light is hitting. So I just added a small patch of magenta light over here. So now, when we move forwards, we're going to introduce the lights of the car. So that's the taillights and the headlights. We're going to take the ambient exposure that we took just of the lights of the car without any light painting, and we're going to set it to screen. Now, we set it to screen instead of lighten because from experience I noticed that when it comes to things like headlights and taillights, it's better to use screen instead of lighten because the transition of the layers isn't as harsh. It adds a bit more haziness to the photo, and it just in general looks a bit better. So if we add this exposure over here, we can see that it adds the taillights, it adds the headlights, and it also adds some taillight bleed over here, this little red patch of color over here. And I also introduced a mask because I didn't want it bleeding everywhere in the image. As you can see, it's on the top like of the ceiling over here. It's on the wheels. I just didn't want that. So I basically just masked the parts where I did want them. So it's actually just over here, and the whole front of the car, lighting up the gate over there. Now, as you can see, I didn't introduce the taillight bleed in this exposure because what I like to do in terms of that, I like to duplicate the same layer, which is the one that we just added. So it's actually this one over here. And I actually introduced a mask just of the red color bleed over here. So if you turn it on and off, it's masked out just to the ground. Now, the reason I do it on a separate layer is because I can actually duplicate it. And what happens when you duplicate this thing, it just makes it brighter, as you can see over here. So if we can just duplicate it a few more times, hope that's a bit over-exaggerating it. But yeah, when you're adding headlights and taillights, it's a pretty good practice to basically have just the taillights and just the headlights on one layer and the bleed to have it on a separate layer, just so you can duplicate it and have it more stronger or less if you want to. So as you can see, I added it 3 times. I duplicated it 3 times over here. And if we remove the masks. So yeah, this is like the first one, the second one, and the third one, just to have a bit more punch to it. And we're actually kind of done with the image in terms of stacking all of the light painting layers and adding the color casts. So what's left is actually the cleanup, the most fun part. So in terms of cleanup, what I did is I pretty much took just the clone stamp, the healing brush tool. I mean, you're all familiar with the process of cleaning unwanted things in Photoshop. I didn't like how this part looked, so I just masked it out. As well, there was some wires hanging over here, so I also masked that out as well. What else do we have over here that I cleaned? Oh yeah, like the whole body of the car. It was covered in all of these little spots from all these lights hitting it, so it's best to just take your time, grab a cup of tea, and just go everywhere, clean these little spots. It might be tedious, it's a long process, but in the end it's going to be worth it, because every little spot that you clean, it just makes the final image way better. So this is just a layer to clean everything up. I'm just going to turn it on and off a few times so you can see the differences. Mostly just clone stamping. Pretty much the image is done. What I do, there's also a few layers left over. What I did in this particular case is I wanted a custom number plate. So I introduced a custom number plate. I'm going to quickly show you how I do it actually. So what you do is you basically just mask this part of the number, as you can see over here. Then I create a new layer. I add a fill of color, and I select the exact color that the number plate is. So I just click it over here. I click it OK, and it adds just a white patch. And then it's best to just add a bit of noise to match it to the rest of the image. I usually just add like 1% or something. And once you have that, you just basically have a clean plate to work on. And in this case, I just took a custom PNG, which in this case is Hammersmith Motors. It's like the garage that this Porsche was shot in. And I just added it to the number plate. It's pretty fairly straightforward. And that's actually kind of it. A lot of photographers like to add some color grading onto the final image. But when it comes to light painting, I usually don't really color grade my images because I just like the natural look of it. I mean, I could add some gradient maps, I could add some selective color adjustments, but that's just usually not my style when it comes to light painting. When I strobe, I usually do some color corrections, yeah, but when I light paint, I just keep it as natural as I can. So in terms of final adjustments, what I really do when I'm finished with the process of stacking everything in Photoshop, I just save it, I go back into Lightroom, and I just add some clarity, some sharpness, a bit of noise reduction, nothing really too out of the ordinary. I don't do any color adjustments, just to make it pop a bit more, really. So that's about it when it comes to retouching of this photo. Hopefully you got something out of it. I know that my process of editing might be a bit messy. I try to keep it as clean as possible for this tutorial. Usually it's a bit worse than that when I'm working on my own. But then again, I really hope that this has been helpful. Thank you very much again, Mo, for inviting me onto the show, and have fun creating.